For today's webinar, we have Bruce Houlihan from the Orange County Crime Lab presenting Data Systems Imperative in 21st Century Forensic Services. Without further delay, here's Bruce.
Well, hello, everybody. It's good to be with you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the importance of information systems in 21st century forensics. The word that I've used in the title of the presentation is imperative, and it's a strong word, but I really come to believe over the last few years that this is something that's going to be critical for us in public service, not just to implement, but to implement correctly so that our services and the requirements that we're going to be having as we serve our constituents are met. So let me start on what the problems are and where we're currently at and why this is necessary. I'll talk a little bit about a high-level overview of some of the critical pieces. I have four descriptors that I'll actually use for this. We'll talk about some applications through the process, but what I want to end with are some examples and I think some good implementations in the industry that can help us, and maybe some decisions that we can actually make to implement some of these things. So the first question that comes up, of course, is why did I use imperative? So the crux, or really the thesis of what I'm trying to describe, is that I don't think we can really function successfully in the future without a vital information technology or a data system infrastructure in our organizations. And this is more than just an add-on service that we have, like our electricity or plumbing that we have in our organizations. I'm going to be talking about a kernel function, and I'll talk about how IT is not a utility a little later. But from the get-go, we need to be rethinking IT as one of the primary methodologies that we use to get the information that we need for our stakeholders. It's not just an add-on like we have for buying phones after we move into an organization. One of the big difficulties we have, and everybody's facing the same thing, is that our resources are dwindling. We do not have the funding that we used to have in all areas of public service, and the staffing that we actually need is not being given to us. We have to fight for really the resources or the structure that we need to do the work that we're doing. But at the same time, our expectations are rising. There's less tolerance for mistakes. There's more requirements for how fast we turn things around, and our expectations of quality are a lot higher than they actually used to be. And that's wholly appropriate, but it can be difficult when you're not provided the resources that you actually need. So I wrap this up in saying, doing more with less. I've heard that moniker somewhere, that phrase so much, that is just part and parcel with our expectations. So what I tell some of my bosses and stakeholders that we're sprinting all the time now. We've forgotten really how to walk. Sprinting used to be something we would do when we needed, when something was urgent, but now we're actually, it seems like, sprinting all the time. So our staffing is decreasing. As I mentioned, our expectations are higher. People want more, they want it quicker, they want it higher quality, they want more detailed information, and they want to use the information in a more automated, more functional way than they have in the past. The number of cases that we are doing here at the Orange County Crime Lab, as I'm sure is in your organization, have not decreased. Again, the expectations are higher. But one of the most significant things is the rates of change in our industry, and especially in forensic science, is increasing. So it's not just the expectations are increasing, is that the increases are increasing, if I could put it that way. And we have to adapt. A good functional IT unit is really one of the best solutions that we have available to us. So it's a real opportunity for us to provide some answers when we don't have many choices to actually deal with. I don't know if you found with your clients, our clients are very resistant to them implementing changes that we want to make. So being more tolerant to make sure that things we provide to them are easier for them to do with less impact on their work. They are consuming more of our data, and the more data that you'll learn to release and make available, the more they're going to use it, but it also gives us the ability to make better decisions. And something that we've had in the last 5 years, it's not just discovery, but the legal requirements that we have to release the information and to make it public are also increasing. As you know, the courts don't give us any money to actually implement public record acts or discovery requests. We're just expected to give more and more and more in the same amount of time with actually the same staffing. So when we move to IT as a core function, some characteristics that I think we need to see. The first is that we need to have a solid understanding of how to build databases and information stores locally. We want information to be here so the authors, which is us, can actually be the ones that control it. There are optionally external data stores and shared data stores in our industry. That's great. Balancing both internal and external is important. One of the primary mechanisms of exposing information and allowing an interchange is with web servers, but this can be provided both internal to your organization and external as well. When we get to security, we'll talk about firewalls and how important they are. They are definitely critical. And we don't talk about it too much, except for those that are involved in details, but the network infrastructure, making sure you're facilitating the changes you're going to have to meet are critical. Allowing your staff to work from home, doing things non-locally. And I'm going to argue that an internal functioning IT staff unit is becoming even more critical than it was before. Centralized IT services or IT services part of a global organization have its place, but the more direct control you have for steering the activity of your IT staff, including not just networking, but including the application development, the web development, and your databasing, the more ability you're going to have to adapt to those rates of change. We should be the ones that enable the facilitation of changes. Too often we are responding to the requests and demands that we have from our clients, but the more we can actually author those and script those and help design those, the better we're actually going to be about providing solutions. So moving from this passive, reactive posture to one that's much more creative, defining, authoring, and structuring and steering is really going to help us move to answering a lot of these challenges. And as I said at the beginning, I think we should begin thinking about information technology as a kernel operation or a core operation. I mean, if we're doing scientific analysis, sure, the science is critical, but I think IT is just as important as the science. So local information technology is, I think, where we start without, of course, compromising the sharing and the exchange that we have to do. But this is building an IT infrastructure internally. It's hiring IT staff. It's having your own databases, your own web servers, the people that can answer the technology needs, answer those questions that you have. You want your IT group to be high functioning. It's not just people that have, are good with computers or know how to use Excel anymore. Computer scientists are critical to our operations. Now, we mix here at the Orange County Crab, we mix both scientists and computer scientists together, but they work very closely together and they serve each other. That's very, very important. And as we facilitate information exchange, both internal and external to our organization, the goal that we're going to have is in these 4 areas. So I'm going to start with agility, which is how fast we can actually adapt to the changes that the industry demands and the things that we want to do. I'm going to move to how available your data is to your clients. Again, this is both internal and external. So availability is a posture that you have about exchanging information or the protocols and willingness you have to actually open your architecture. Interoperability is really about how you do it. It's a 10-cent word, of course, but it's infrastructure building so that there are exchange mechanisms that allow for automation and the smooth transfer of data both back and forth, internally and again, externally. And finally, we need to talk about security. Security is one of those things that's critical because if you mess it up, the consequences are very dire. It's not the core mission of an IT group, but it's actually something that we do need to address. So I'll conclude with that. So let's jump into agility real quick. So I mentioned that we want rapid changes in the industry and we want our organizations to be able to adapt. If we have a new method, if we actually have a new instrument, if we have a call for a type of analysis, we can't go through the normal procurement, year-long planning, budgeting cycles, and so forth to actually do this. The requirements that are being placed on us to do this quickly have never been greater. So the ability to adapt those changes, and that really requires an internal control and driving posture, is really a measure of how successful we're actually going to be. By the time some of our older methodologies are developed or are used, by that I mean budgeting and procurement with outside vendors always, sometimes the industry has moved on and we're wasting a lot of time because we can't adapt quick enough. Now this has good and bad sides, but to give you some examples, I think For a while, the industry is built on us buying software, procuring, finding a software that meets our needs, and then we adapt our business operations to those software specifications or how the software works. We buy something off the shelf, and then we adapt our businesses to do that. This could be a LIMS system. This could be anything we do. I mean, we do this with Microsoft Office. We all learn how to use Microsoft Office because there are very few alternatives in the industry. This is not the best way to work, though, because we are changing to what the software vendors are doing on a very generic product, right? Ideally, we would have our business needs and the software would be written to adapt to those business needs. That's really where we want to go. And an internal IT infrastructure and perspective is critically important. That requires internal expertise, that allows you to invest in actually designing the software, the models that you're actually using, with your educated people that can give you good feedback. That is what is going to allow you to adapt to the changes that you actually need both internally and from your clients. A lot of this is based on mandates too. Whether it's a legal mandate or whether it's a privacy mandate or your governmental organization, whatever the mandate happens to be, we are forced to change in some things, and then there are other things that we want to change. Now, generally the latter, we skip. We don't have time to deal with what we really want to do. We spend most of our time dealing with what we have to do. We should move beyond this. But if we don't move quick enough, we're going to be constantly diagnosing and responding rather than actually authoring some of the changes. And if we don't respond quick enough, we won't be able to respond at all. So we'll be moving on to something else, and we lost the opportunity to respond to that segment of the industry. I'll talk about driving under the influence of drugs in a little bit. But the software that we buy and the software that we design should be driven by the solutions that we actually want to provide. We should not be servants of the software, especially what the vendors actually think we need to do with the software. So moving those actions and decisions to the people who are using the software is something that will be important for us to prioritize. The difference between a PT boat and a cruise ships provide, an all-in-one functionality. They have a lot of options. You've got food, you've got entertainment, you've got the whole kitchen sink, but they are very difficult to steer. I'm not sure we're in a cruise ship mentality anymore. I think our industry and the services that we provide are more like a PT boat. Fast, agile, quick, not a lot of infrastructure, but we can respond in a rapid fashion for our clients. You don't necessarily have to, you're constantly developing because you don't have the resources that a cruise ship might have, but you can actually respond appropriately. Some of you may know Max Haug. He's a professor that actually works at West Virginia University, another university in Florida. He's been in the forensics industry for quite a while. He and I were having a conversation a few years ago, and I was expressing my frustration with some of the responses by our staff to protocols that were in place. And staff, will respond, well, I just forgot to do it. I didn't realize I needed to do this. Yeah, I forgot the policy, or I didn't realize what it meant this. And so you have systems in place to streamline operations in a certain way. And the staff, as we all do as human beings, sometimes miss the mark. But Max's response was interesting because he said, really what you have is a system problem, not a staff problem, because your systems should be designed that these things don't happen. Now, that's an ideal situation because I don't know if we can always do this, but there's a kernel of truth here that's very important. A gentleman by the name of Don Norman wrote a book a few years ago called The Design of Everyday Things. And he studied how objects that we use every day are actually designed. Are they designed for aesthetics? Are they designed for usability? Or are they designed for how people want to use them? There's an example of car manufacturers wanting to make safer cars because kids were locking themselves in the trunks of cars and they couldn't get out. So they studied the best way to provide a door, opening mechanism for the trunk by putting people in trunks, including kids. And the long and short of it is they ended up on a handle that was very similar to a door handle, which is kind of a lever that you turn down and opens the door. Because everybody knew what to do with that, as opposed to pulling a wire loop or doing something else. So designing things that work the way people work is best. And that requires, though, that we invest in the infrastructure with the software that we have, the IT staff that we have, so you have direct control of how things are actually done in your organization, so that we can build teapots, as the picture shows here, that works the way people actually want to work. So one of the problems with agility is trying to minimize the bureaucratic processes that we actually have. A lot of this is purchasing, a lot of it's procurement, it's contracts, it's the world we live in, and it is important, it's a reality, but it may not always be the best way to do things. Focusing more on function, speed of results, and how quickly we can steer that PT boat can help. Again, this requires, though, investing in a local IT infrastructure and prioritizing the control and authoring that you can have of these things. So with that internal IT structure, I would encourage you to try to decentralize your IT staff. Instead of a large organization have an IT unit that's kind of farmed out or borrowed to individual pieces, try to develop things globally. It's a constant battle with decision makers, especially on my part, but it has very real benefits and consequences. A lot of organizations are moving towards cloud storage. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later because it has pros and cons, good things and bad things, of course. But try to be able to direct the decisions that are actually made about how these solutions are provided. The cost savings can be pretty major. We developed our LIM system in-house and saved our county millions of dollars over the years. But there are time and staffing costs, and it's not always evident to the decision makers that the cost savings will be there, but they really are. And so that's a definite selling point with actually doing things yourself. But you also have to be invested into security, and it's not something you can actually just ignore and add on later. So it has to be one of the primary thought processes that you have at the very beginning. But also, don't stifle the creativity and adaptation that we actually can have. I think we have a tendency to, with larger IT infrastructures, that we're tired of people doing things their own way. And so I'm going to tighten the screws and make sure people can't make their own decisions. You can't have your own databases. You tighten the protocols down. So we are so reactive on security and maybe some of the administrative things that we didn't like that we are preventing people from actually doing the work. This is something I think we have to resist in a positive way, of course, but we don't want to stifle the creativity and adaptation that we can actually have, that we're being required to do in our industry because larger organizations want to control things so they see the minimal risk. So again, balancing is very important. But one of the things you can actually start implementing is for decision makers, managers, your supervisors, your staff, give them the ability to search your data. So write their own custom reports, be able to write their own queries. It's amazing what can be opened up if they can have available to them what fields are available, what fields can be searched. Things can be done real time. They don't wait for a report that's maybe months old. They can actually see today what cases are pending, for example. It also allows them to be involved in what information is available to collect, or what can I find out before they actually start asking questions. Now you have to put good information in. That's the garbage in, garbage out acronym here. You also may have to decide what's not necessary. But that ability to control, or excuse me, to diagnose what's going on in your organization is something that should be really at the hands of the users and certainly the managers. So telling a manager that there's some advantages in learning structured querying language usually gets met with eye rolling when I talk about it. But this is an example down the bottom here of a database query. But being able to actually get the information you need right away is something that we've learned to give to our supervisors and our leaders. And some of you may be familiar with Crystal Reports, which is a reporting engine. It uses the database fields that you actually have. But being able to give customizable reports that can query the data directly is a big advantage for your actual users. Agility also depends on implementing automation. So we want to get rid of the manual and repetitive processes as much as possible. I like to say that if you're doing the same thing more than twice, you should begin thinking about whether I should automate it. Humans are really not good at doing repetitive processes many, many times without zoning out. But we don't have the resources anymore to dedicate constantly doing repetitive processes when we have highly educated people that need to be doing more thought-intensive procedures that we actually have in our organization. So building the automation locally, building the automation when you're sharing data publicly can really benefit your organization. It should be passive, which means it doesn't need intervention unless there's a problem. Most instruments allow for macros and scripting, but moving into your own application development program can help this as well. I would encourage you to make sure that you have very good automation built into the instruments that you actually buy. And that's not just macros and scripts. Do they allow exporting of data formats? Are they open source, not open source, but are they open definition file formats, for example? And does your LIMS allow both input and output clearly. And as things are beginning to move to the cloud a little bit, how you implemented this internally in your organization is going to facilitate whether you can actually work in sharing data, both push and pull, with organizations just as well. So moving to availability, let me talk quickly of the importance of sharing. So again, this is both internal and external. Very little of what we do in a forensic organization now is one simple type of thing that doesn't need to talk to a completely different architecture. So whether it's our DNA analysis that actually need information on a case for us from toxicology, for example. So build into your systems the importance of sharing it all over your organization. Once you've done that, you then are able to talk about how to share the information in larger, more global organizations with your colleagues, your stakeholders, and so forth. You can begin consuming their data to help you make better choices and better decisions. So one of the areas where we've done this is our driving under the influence of drugs data in Orange County. For the last 10 years or so, we've had a very strong partnership with the Office of Traffic Safety in California, but also in the dialogues nationally with marijuana driving, fentanyl driving, and so forth. And at the very beginning, we decided to make our data, it's anonymized, of course, we make our data available to our clients, our stakeholders. So a couple of models that we actually use, some of you may be familiar with NIFLS. NIFLS provides a centralized acquisition system from crime laboratories on both solid dose or seized drugs, but also on driving the influence. So an example of driving drugs that we actually find is on the left that we provide in NIFLS, and what's on the right is from our seized drug submissions. These are all automated. These are actually fed into a federal system. And this data is consumed and provides, like a lot of other labs do too, a lot of other labs, information on national trends. But that sharing, again, is two directions, right? Push-pull. I'm sharing that information with NIFLS. In turn, I get the benefits of NIFLS data. But we have to build into our systems the ability actually to do this. So give your staff the ability to access the data that they actually have and be able to manipulate it and use it as they need. Give them the ability to make searches. Allow them to be both diagnostic. This is not working well. We don't like this. We like to make this change. Open up their creativity for how this information can actually be used. And as a government organization, we actually should be responding quickly, because if we don't, it will usually pass us by. And remember, as being in government, we're not in a competitive industry. And so this idea of intellectual property is something that we don't actually have to deal with, right? So we should be sharing information more. It's public space, it's publicly funded. So we have an incentive to actually open this up and not just circle our wagons and protect what we're actually doing. We really are going to be serving the public and your own internal organization better. I'm a big fan of HIDA's OD tools and facilities. This is, again, information that we provide. Medical examiners provide information and others do. But it's a real-time contribution that provides national maps on overdose occurrences in the United States. They provide a website that users can actually use. But the key here is that it's real-time. So we provide this data as quick as possible, and there's a real-time modeling of where incidents might be happening. Now, you really can't make this happen well without automating, because the manual entries can be time-consuming. But the users can actually use this information, and it was used for a lot of the overdoses, especially on the East Coast, that were happening in Ohio and other places. But pushing this data in an automated fashion doesn't burden your staff. ODMAP and other users can actually benefit from what's going on nationally. And if this is built into your LIMS system with the security of a demilitarized zone or protected servers, you can actually do this with very little cost. And then, of course, the benefit to your organization on savings is going to be great. So there's both central and local data responsibilities that we actually have. The data that is authored by my organization needs to be controlled by me. But from the get-go, I need a mindset that I'm going to be sharing this, I'm going to be protecting it, I'm going to make it available without compromising any of the requirements I have, like individual privacy, legal mandates, and so forth. But this requires me to do some research about what fields I need to collect, the data types I want to collect, what's most exchangeable with others, what I'm going to be using external and external, all important. And try not to be tied to vendors. Vendors are great partners with us, but everything needs to be thought of in terms of being source agnostic. we don't know what's going to happen in the next few years or even next year in terms of what standards are going to be there, what software is going to be there, what databases are going to be available. So how you do things, keep an eye to using open source or using open standards as much as possible. Avoid the proprietary storage and exchange because it's going to really stifle your ability to do things in the future when those standards actually change. And that, again, is both external and external. So I like to say use some of the very common databases on the market. Don't write your own database, of course, but I mean something like SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL. Try to make your application architectures not tied to a particular database so you can change how you write the applications, make them agnostic. So if you have to change that, it doesn't mess anything up. It connects to the database is fine. And you have the flexibility of constantly changing with the industry without actually losing your core data and your core information that is the service that you provide. The industry is going to change. Companies go out of business all the time. New companies actually come in. Some companies are more flexible, some companies are more static. So allowing yourself the flexibility to adapt and conform to those changes will serve you well. There's a lot of work going on in providing exchange servers, for lack of a better term. One of these is REST, and I'll talk about them real quickly later. But these are central stores for sending data and retrieving data in an automated fashion, in an open source fashion, in a simplified fashion, so people can use, consume, and contribute with the data. Now, who provides these REST servers are some important questions, whether it's public or private, depends a lot on the data. The nice thing about the government is that we serve the public, and so we have an incentive to do this with public functionality in mind, but there's still a lot of academic partners that do this, but there are still some private vendors that actually do this. Google and others have REST servers that provide particular information. So who's providing the information, who's consuming it, how we get it to those servers, that's the push and the pull, and how we consume it are all important. The APIs or the programming interfaces are the details about how you get the information, how you query it, how I push it back, the security, and so forth. There are vendor APIs you can actually use. There are governmental APIs like HIDA. We write our own APIs, for example, here that our district attorney and our clients can actually use, and they serve us well, both internally and externally. APIs can be very, very simple that you might want to use locally. They can be very complicated. They can have high security. They can have minimal security. They can be providing information to the instruments between agencies, but keeping open to the fact that I have a priority of putting APIs into my systems when I build them, I think is a mindset that I'm really trying to market here. The moniker that's typically used with APIs is web services, but these are, if you think of it as an automated way of having not a visible web page, but information that's actually exchanged, right? So, but you put a server usually on the internet, or it can be internal. Those individuals on the internet or your clients can actually access on your server, and your internal servers are the ones that interact with the data, retrieve the data, and use the data. Now, your users, stakeholders are not talking to the databases directly. That's what your servers actually do. That's why this is behind a firewall in this picture. The old moniker, which you don't hear about too much anymore, but SOAP XML, is kind of the protocol or the formatting of the information that you actually see. There's a little bit more formatting with SOAP XML or XML, so a little bit more volume of data, but it's still relatively the standard for how we're exchanging information. But it's text-based, it's very easy to read, but as long as it's done in an automated fashion, it works very, very well. REST and JSON is actually relatively new. These are actually servers that can sit in your organization, but generally are serving a larger sets of clients. And it's a little bit simpler, a little less formatting and little looser protocols. And the servers themselves actually take care of the formatting and organization of the data. It's becoming a very robust and popular way of exchanging information. This is very, very good for systems like HIDA actually uses this with ODMAP. Very supportive of them doing that because it makes it very easy for us to push and pull data directly with it. The computers and the servers you actually need may be overkill a little bit for an internal organization, but it's very good for providing information for a large number of clients. So these are examples. On the left is what XML looks like. What's on the right is what REST looks like. Like I said, a little bit more forgiving, but you can see both of these are really based on text, just characters you can type on your keyboard. There's a reason for that. you can get to the information. And so focusing on simple, standard ways of exchanging this can save you a lot of time and energy later, because you don't have to decode proprietary file formats and things that only maybe one vendor actually use, right? So the reason why the web and our exchange on the web is actually built on this now. So build your databases locally first, as robust as you can. Make sure they're designed so that sharing information is going to be a priority. You have to decide what you're going to collect, whether it's required or whether it's actually needed. There's a tendency to collect everything because we may need it later. Sure, that can be important, but you could also be spending too much time collecting that information that will never be used. So there's a balancing act that you have to do when you're using and designing your actual local databases. But this is true for the local applications you develop as well. A lot of organizations are not building their own applications. This is something I highly encourage if possible. It requires an IT infrastructure, but allowing you to build modules that can be complementary with your LIMS system, so it can access the databases directly, not necessarily with the vendor software, but it gives you more flexibility. Your instruments are exchanging data constantly. They work with the LIMS systems. There's the Internet of Things. This is the modern toaster or light switch and stuff that's plugged in the internet. I'll give you an example in just a minute. Our devices now, even our balances, our robots, our pipette calculators, are all plugged in to a network. So think of this in mind and plan for this in the future, that your network infrastructure and the applications that you can write to interact with this data is going to be very, very important for your flexibility later. When you're choose vendors that prioritize these interfaces. Can you get information in and out? Are the formats they have for exporting files and importing, are they open to you? Are they well documented? Are they easy to get to so you can put them in your LIMS system, for example? Do they provide macros? Are they using common databases, or is it proprietary so you can't get to the data without using their software? I would move away from those. Most of the vendors that we use in the crime lab here, we require that they use Microsoft SQL Server as a database backend, that I can get to the data without using their front-end software. Their front-end software, if it's written well, we'll use. It's great, but I want to be able to get to the data in case there's a solution that they're not providing that I need to be able to do. So to give you an example of an Internet of Things type of device, we had an old architecture years ago that was acquiring temperature data from our refrigerators, our freezers, our rooms, and it just really wasn't working well because it wasn't connected. It was a turnkey system that was proprietary. We just weren't getting the information that we needed. So we were going to build some devices built based on Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, if you're familiar with those. But there was a product on the market called DAQ that we actually researched and made very, very well. These are very small devices that have very simple, probably an Arduino, electronic device with a very simple FTP or web server in them that allow you to query them, and you simply plug them into our network. So what we did is bought a whole bunch of these devices with the temperature probes, put them in all of our refrigerator freezers, in our temperature controlled rooms, where we actually need to see the temperatures, and then wrote an application internally with our IT staff to actually monitor these temperatures and plot them on a real-time basis. But by doing this now, we have 40, 50 devices that we're monitoring constantly. We can do plots for our maintenance people. But when I can take this data, get it out of the databases, put it in our LIMS, put it in our equipment logs, I can log it if I need to for our accreditation purposes, makes things a lot simpler. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the output that you get is straight XML. Very open file format, easy to get to. Huge solution. It's saved us a lot of money to begin with, but it also made it a lot more flexible for our clients. NIFLIS, as I mentioned, NIFLIS and ODMAP are really good solutions as an example, so you want to do some more research on this. NIFLIS, the individual organizations push their data, and they're able to collect as an aggregate, because NIFLIS will do most of the work for the stats. But ODMAP is really based on REST infrastructure, and it's real time. Very easy to get data in once you go into the simple protocols, and the data is very, very usable when it's complete. So let me conclude by talking about security. This is a necessary evil. Security needs to be implemented at all layers and really from the get-go. Security can be complicated sometimes, and it can prevent you from doing what you need to do. But if you start at the beginning and build it into your solutions from the beginning, it makes it a lot easier than try to add it in after you're done. Security, however, is not the mission of an organization. It serves the mission. So make sure you don't compromise with what your goal is and then implementing the security that you need to actually do it. Don't let the security, because it sometimes can take over, don't let security be the mission, right? So your services are the mission. Security is actually a tool that you actually use, but start as soon as possible, because the consequences of not actually doing things correctly are pretty dire. So you want to make sure that your information is not alterable when it's not supposed to be, that the information is confidential. We have a lot of legal HIPAA requirements and so forth about our information, but you also want to make it available. The tools with security make it available without compromising the other. And you want logging or traceability requirements, so if something happens, you can find out what went wrong. And usually what's discussed are firewalls, which are really network gates. You can control the access. Two-factor authentication, this is where you have to use a second fingerprint, or you may have to use a second password, or even facial recognition. The FBI on their networks now are beginning to require it. CGIS is a good example for particular types of data. So you want this that doesn't interrupt your staff's work too much, but it's something you should be considering. Encryption has to be done in place. There are a lot of legal requirements to actually do this. You want to make sure that the information is not easy to get to for people that don't have the rights to get to it. And you may want to consider cloud storage. Of course, backups and disaster recovery, which are really offsite locations in case something happens to your primary sources, is important. But make sure you have internal direct control of the information that you're authoring, information you're controlling. I'm very uncomfortable turning it over to an outside vendor to do, unless you absolutely positively have to do this because you don't have the staffing. But by, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? You've heard that expression. By turning that over to a vendor, things can get difficult. But of course, the consequences of not doing this correct are ransomware. We've all heard many situations of entire networks being shut down because the security was not done correctly. So how much you isolate and how much you make available is important. Real quick about cloud storage, there's a tendency now, I think, to give this to a vendor like Microsoft or Google or Azure or other vendors to actually do things for you. But the advantages are there's central administration, they usually use standards, they do the backups for you. If you don't have the resources to have an IT infrastructure, that can be a lot of large organizations like this, but there are some downsides. You don't own the data. Well, you may own the data, maybe, but they have possession of the data. So there's a conflict. You've got to negotiate with them to get what you need. The vendor can have problems. It happens. Even Microsoft had a problem with some of their cloud services a few years ago. Clouds do go down. If your entire organization shuts down because of that, that can be an issue. How long will it take you to implement the changes? What happens if you have a disagreement with the vendor? And what happens if your connectivity between you and the vendor are a problem? Sometimes the vendor says, it's your connectivity. I don't have any responsibility with that. Okay. So I've talked about the two models with XML and REST, but you notice the positions of the firewalls. So one firewall is great, but two firewalls are better. So you never have too many firewalls, but they require more attention to the details and the rules and so forth. But one of the nice things about REST is there are firewalls on both ends that actually can protect your clients. So I would, again, recommend that you invest in the firewalls and good servers. Make sure you're aware of the legal mandates. And you want to have the protection that you can without dealing with the damage that can actually occur. So in summary, again, we want our solutions to be agile. We want them to be available. They should be interoperable, and they should be secure. So do we have the ability to plan really successfully for the future and be able to make those changes, or we're really just responding and reacting? Make sure that what is urgent in our organization does not take over what's really, really important. That's going to require planning. I would encourage you to consider working IT as a core kernel function of your organization rather than farming out or dealing with a consensus with large organizations. And analytics, which is the ability to actually diagnose from your data before you actually know what you need to do, is something you might want to consider. So the LIMS system that we use here in Orange County, we authored ourselves. That allows us to make rapid code changes. Our users have input on what happens with the LIMS system. Our developer costs really are not as expensive as you might think. Our users have the ability to diagnose and do searches themselves. We are constantly connecting to instruments and new equipment as it comes in and changing. Those rules change. We've automated as much as possible. I say to my bosses that our automation takes the place probably maybe 20 people, and it's something that is critical since I don't have the people to be able to do the work. And for our external clients, we do a lot of web publishing for this data. We use HIDA and ODMAP. It's a great partnership. I think they've really designed this well. If you're not a partner, I would encourage you to actually look at what it can do for you. Predictive modeling is really kind of the wave of the future. If you remember the Tom Cruise movie, The Minority Report, we're predicting where crimes are going to occur before they actually happened. But looking at analytically about your data. There's predictive policing going on right now about where crimes occur at different times of year, for example. But if you could look at your data and develop analytics about your data, you might be able to predict problems before they actually occur, so you can actually plan for them if you have the IT infrastructure allowing you to make changes as necessary. I mentioned how discoveries are becoming verbose and extremely broad. The solution is going to be automating your information so that your staff just don't have more and more work to do. The medical legal death investigation field is, I'm one of the individuals working on this with other partners nationally. How we exchange data in the medical examiner coroner space is very, very critical to national drug trends. And of course, some of you are familiar with all the databases that are actually used in forensics, like CODIS and AVIS and so forth. One of the things we're actually doing with MDI is developing a central way of sharing standards, fields, and so forth to try to solve these problems. So I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I hope this has been beneficial for you. I know we're going to have a question and answer period next, but I want to make available my email address and phone number if you'd like to talk further about this as well offline. But again, I hope this has been beneficial, and I hope this can actually help you provide better solutions in the next 5-10 years. So thank you again for your time. It's been enjoyable for me as well.
All right. Thank you, Bruce, for such a fantastic and informative presentation. Let's go ahead and get right into some questions from the audience. First one that I have here is with regards to internal IT staff. Did Orange County Crime Lab come up with a formula, as in something along the lines of number of IT professionals for work needed, to determine how many specific people or staff that you needed for your purposes?
It was a gradual process. It wasn't immediate, but I think at a minimum you need a database architect, you need an application developer, you need a web developer. Sometimes they can be the same person, and you need network support. If you have more resources, I would have 2 people in each of those functions at a minimum. It depends, of course, on the size of your organization, how many clients you're actually serving, but those 4 to 6 people, I think, can serve most organizations if possible. That's a tough sell. We have about 150 people here, so it's not as difficult as a lab or an organization that may only have 10 people, getting 6 that are in IT services.
That actually leads right into another follow-up question, which was Orange County being a large area, that is one thing, but for smaller labs, would a shared IT professionals between adjacent labs and agency be a good idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key, because there's different resources available to you, you have to work with what you have, but the key is being able to control those 4 things that I talked about. It's being able to drive what's happening rather than just constantly responding. So the more flexibility you have about setting functions of your software, about how you get the data in and out, being able to control things quicker, that's really the key. So do whatever you can to implement that. It's just a lot easier if those people are working directly for you, because then you can set the priorities without competition. But there are some organizations where IT units are shared, and so you have cooperative meetings about setting priorities. So do whatever you can, but try to develop a system where you can actually start driving what's happening rather than responding all day.
Absolutely. I have a situational kind of conversation that came up. What suggestions could you provide when your organization's IT department does not allow access to the backend database?
Well, I think you probably find why, and it's generally going to be security, but there may be administrative reasons as well. Some organizations don't like the fact that data is separated out. They want it one central location. But one solution you may have is to make a copy of the data, and so you get, I think one of the commenters said snapshots. So you're not getting the actual data, but you're actually getting regular copies that you can actually work with. It doesn't allow you to contribute the data maybe as fast as you want to, but you can certainly work with the data if you don't have any other options. You may have ability to get more direct interactions with the IT unit, as long as they feel they can control the type of access and how it's done. So usually it's security that's driving those kind of decisions by the IT group, and there are ways around that. So having that dialogue with them so they know that you're not trying to change things inappropriately, you're just querying. There may be some training involved and so forth, but I think it can be done. It just requires some communication and dialogue.
What are some of the other kind of difficult hurdles or challenges when implementing an internal IT unit?
So probably the biggest thing, I think everybody's thinking about this, but it's the philosophy. It's being able to convince the people that have the money in your organizations, the people that make the higher level decisions, that this is necessary. IT used to be this way 20 years ago and 30 years ago. Everybody had their own little IT units that were actually providing very quick solutions. And then there were some problems. There were some maybe poor decisions made by certain individuals and maybe a few cost savings. So IT became more and more centralized, but I think a larger driver was that everybody had IT, so why don't we make it one big organization? But what we sacrificed in doing that is the agility and the flexibility that we had and control of what was going on by centralizing everything. So I think the final answer here is you've got to be able to do both. You need to have central where it's necessary, but you need to pull back some of this function and work with both groups so you can actually define the context of doing your own work. So getting that philosophy to change a little bit, that I have to provide these results quicker, faster, with higher quality, and I have to drive these decisions, and I can't do it if there's this huge bureaucracy. And so being solution focused on why it helps, I think, is the first step.
So to that end, what are the options for developing agile customized software solutions? What has the greatest chance of success?
Well, as you probably heard from the presentation, I think building your own IT unit is probably the easiest and the best. Not the easiest, but probably the best solution. Computer science is not as difficult as maybe some other forensic disciplines because there's not a 3 or 4 year training program once you hire someone. You can get computer scientists that are trained right out the get-go, and they can start working within a couple of weeks as long as once they learn your organization's culture. So I think that's still best, but we've already talked about sharing IT functions. If you have to contract with IT companies, and that contracting can be done on a very large scale, it can be done on an ad hoc scale, they can be short-term contractors. There's a lot of options in both web developer, application developers, database developers. And so you may not be able to hire a full-time employee, but you may be able to contract with groups to do work. So you have, like a contract that works for 3 years, but you can call them anytime you need something developed. So that is another option you have available to you. But if you can't do any of that and you have to work a large central IT organization, expressing them the challenges of getting things quicker and having them maybe assign IT staff as much as possible is another option you have available to you.
So I have a question here from the audience. It's kind of a little bit it is specific to DNA profile information, but please feel free to kind of expand on it because I think this is it definitely is. It hits notes in a lot of different aspects of forensic sciences and forensic services. But their question is, are there certain challenges in availability and interoperability in IT software for forensic data? In their case, they are specifically asking about forensic data that involves DNA profile information that can result in a breach of genetic privacy. And again, I say that because I think that is probably a common thread across multiple aspects of a crime lab or forensic services in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just DNA. I mean, everything that we do in a forensic lab potentially could be linked to a victim or even a suspect. And so there are privacy issues. Some of it's even legally mandated, of course. But the first step, I think, is to make sure that you have control over those switches. So you have a mindset of making it available, but being able to make sure that things aren't done without your knowledge about protocols is important. Information, I think, can be anonymized, and depending on the sensitivity of the data, anonymizing that data is actually important as you publish it. So most organizations and what our public record acts or discoveries and so forth, I mean, if we're giving biographic data like we have to on a discovery, we put protected orders. So it's not put in the matter of the public record, it's specific to that case. But if you can anonymize the data so there's really no way to trace it back to individuals or companies or businesses and so forth, that's the best way of doing it. So when we're sharing nationally, for example, sexual assault kit processing and evidence, we all talk about how many kits we actually process in a month or the increases that we have. We never give out information, of course, that are the details of the case. So the information has to be anonymized, and that requires, controls on your part, of course, but being able to give out that de-identified information is important.
Coming up, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I was waiting and definitely figured somebody would bring it up with the remote work and the COVID pandemic. Can you speak to the IT problems your lab may have faced with COVID, and especially shifting so many people to remote work? What did you all already have in place that helped? What needed to be implemented? Those type of things.
The biggest struggle we had, I think, was moving our entire organization at once to remote work. So everybody in our lab, and even at the County of Orange, worked remotely for a period of time. So the county's IT infrastructure and what we had to do in the lab is move the bulk of everybody to remote. So that took a little bit of time because we had selected individuals that were working remotely. So our county did a very good job with tens of thousands of employees doing this, but we were able to get our 150 people within a month or so. Our scientists were the biggest challenge because there's a lot of scientific work that's done in a laboratory, of course. So finding good quality work for them to do remotely is difficult when they spend a lot of time in the lab and working with instruments. So we had to do shift sharing and time sharing and stuff like that to reduce the amount of face-to-face interactions. But I think doing this with our IT group was probably one of the easier pieces of this, because most IT groups are actually working remotely in a sense, even in the building, because they're working at their desk, but the servers and the other things are in different floors. But they're used to actually remotely accessing computers and servers. So transitioning this to working from home was really not that big of a stretch, as long as you had good two-factor authentication and security protections on your network. So once that's done, it was not too much of a struggle for just the IT functions.
Going down that same thread of digital collaboration and doing things remotely, do you have any kind of experience or lesson learned from any instances of where your organization had to do some form of digital collaboration with an external partner? And obviously there are certain things like emails back and forth and the more straightforward stuff, but with different tools and cloud-based infrastructures and whatnot that are coming into more and more normal use. I know in my own personal just perspective that's always kind of a tricky double-edged sword for a lot of forensic services and a lot of crime laboratories to try and utilize those tools to those ways. So do you have any experiences or lessons learned in trying to implement those type of like digital collaboration softwares with external partners?
Sure. I think what you want to avoid is direct interactions network to network. So no one's going to be able to come into my crime lab data or my network, right? And I wouldn't expect to do that with any other organization. So you need a model where you have kind of like the REST server diagrams I had in the presentation, where you have some kind of secure centralized location for doing things. So we set up demilitarized zones or DMZs where these servers are available to the public, but they're not actually in the network for information that we're actually sharing. Probably the biggest collaboration we have is with our district attorney and the courts. So we work with their IT staff, and the easy ones are the ones that have their own IT staff, to use APIs that we both can actually access. Sometimes we can do it internal to county networks, so it's a little bit more secure from the get-go. But that automated exchange between API to API is a really good solution. When we are networking other databases, unfortunately, I don't know if we're as mature as we need to be nationally with crime laboratories. I would like us to have a little bit more centralized exchange processes. And we do a little bit of this, with CGIS, like the FBI is facilitated, but there are a lot of other databases that we really should be sharing and talking to each other. And so having a national infrastructure for a REST server or some kind of secure central location we can all push and pull from is something that will be ideal. I know the MDI working group is actually working towards this, but that's definitely something we want to do.
One more, I think we have time for about one more question, maybe two, but I do want to, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how you had mentioned in your presentation about single sign-on and two-factor authentication and all the different types of ways that we're authenticating users in their access into systems. with SSO becoming such a standard practice, and especially with a lot of organizations utilizing Microsoft or Office 365 as their primary profiles and using that for access with SSO. Has your organization run into any issues with other organizations or even just people within other parts of the Orange County Sheriff's Office where, because the standard is to use your work email address, which is associated with the Microsoft Active Directory and the single sign-on, any type of those kind of non-meshing issues where you're trying to either share information or collaborate or this, that, and the other, and their Microsoft instance doesn't want to work with yours and vice versa?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you have multiple Teams accounts, when you're dealing with virtual meetings, sometimes switching between them can be a nightmare. Microsoft's SharePoint backend for a lot of this requires multiple accounts. Yeah, it gets complicated. I mean, some of our systems use fingerprint, some of them use text-based two-factor, some of them use authenticator apps like Google Authenticate or something like that. So there are a lot of different models. Some organizations use USB keys that move around with you. So it's not simple and streamlined. We're not doing all the same thing yet. Eventually it works, but it could be a challenge sometimes. Absolutely.
For sure. Because that is definitely something we're witnessing here in the FTCOE, just collaborating with a lot of different organizations. But the common thread is that everybody utilizes Microsoft or Office, and so that's tied to their emails. But that's that double-edged sword of then their instance doesn't want to work with ours and vice versa. And it becomes this situation that spirals out of control quickly because you have to find a solution for every situation instead of just one comprehensive one. So, well, I think that is it for us today. I believe that's the end of the questions. So we'll go ahead, Bruce, and start wrapping things up by first saying thank you for taking the time out of your day to present the material, to provide some fantastic answers in the Q&A section. Really was just a great all-around, super informative presentation. So thank you again for taking the time to do all that.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Let me go ahead. We're going to go ahead and get your information up on the screen again, so that way everybody can see your email address as you had put up in your presentation, and just get other ways to try and find out more. Bear with me here. There we go. So again, thank you, Bruce. Here is his contact information for those in the audience, as well as the URL for the Orange County Crime Lab. And we thank you for all the awesome questions and participation out there. Before you leave today's webinar, we ask if you could participate in a short 5-minute survey. You will see a checkbox icon directly above the chat. Simply click that button to be linked to the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback about our webinars is critical information that helps us improve and continue to provide you the best webinar experience possible. If you could please take those few moments to complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to all our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, a link to our website at forensiccoe.org, and a link to listen to episodes of the FTCOE's podcast, Just Science. There's also a link to sign up for the FTCOE newsletter so you can stay up to date with everything that FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.